Welcome to the Department of English, Literature and Creative Writing here at the University of Lancaster. My pleasure to chair this seminar, which is the very first in a series of seminars called Keywords Seminars, taking its cue from Raymond Williams' famous book. And Raymond Williams, as many of you will know, was an important mentor for Professor Terry Eagleton, who is involved in this seminar and will be doing future seminars. Colony, elevation, and friend are future keywords in this series. Today, though, is uselessness, and so I'm delighted to have with me not only my colleague, Professor Terry Eagleton, but our former PhD student, Dr. Andrew Raven. And Andrew will be speaking first. Andrew is the author of several articles: Wordsworth Circle, Keats Shelley Review of English Studies, all coming out of a doctoral thesis that he completed a couple of years ago, entitled Romantic Manuscripts, which is being prepared toward book publication. Andrew will go first, and then Terry will speak, and then we will open the floor to questions. So thank you very much, and over to you, Andrew.
This paper is called Use and Meaning. We can all agree that the Gradgrindian model of utilitarianism offered up at the beginning of hard times should be dismissed out of hand. But we should be wary, I think, of judging utilitarianism itself on the basis of this caricature. Stephen Connor has noted the stupid and vicious misunderstanding of utilitarian philosophy that Dickens bequeathed to literary culture. Bart Schlutz has noted likewise, with recourse to Dickens, how defenders of the humanities have tended to define themselves by their opposition to instrumental or utilitarian approaches to education. I think there is a danger that in celebrating the autotelic, we take too autotelic a view of utility. We should avoid assuming that for utilitarianism, use is an end in itself, rather than a means to an end, which is an end in itself. The utility of an object is not the same as its mere functionality, but is tantamount to its conduciveness to the happiness and the fulfillment of the many and not the few. The apogee of utility might be the paintbrush as opposed to the machine gun. It is useful to think about some different senses of the word use, two of which I've already invoked. The word use is one we are loath to use too readily in connection with human beings. You can be used and abused, not used or abused. And to be misused is, I think, to apprehend an additional sense of maltreatment added to the plain indignity of being used. Perhaps this relates to one rare but interesting usage of use, which pertains to ownership and the right to its enjoyment. It is a word likewise deployed to describe surplus value, plain and simple. In Italian, I believe, use can simply mean profit, which lends an interesting resonance to Marx's distinction between use, value, and surplus. Use can imply the benefit of some finite quality that will one day be used up, giving to the word its synonymity with expired. So that which is useless is that which has been used to the point of being used up, or that which never had the potential to be used up in the first place. Use is a function possessed by a thing which can be extracted from it by way of use, leaving within the used only uselessness where use used to be. To call somebody useless is doubly insulting then, because it first reduces them to the state of an object before adding insult to injury through a withdrawal of the efficacy that we might associate with objects. To be useless is to be categorized as a tool before being recategorized as a good-for-nothing tool. Note also an echo of an Old English adjective, useful, a borrowing from Scandinavian, I believe, a Scandinavian word for unhappy, which in English seems to connote the idea of being wretched, miserable, or lowly. Yet there's a positive result to this double negative insult, which explains why it is often deployed in a playful or affectionate way, because to be a good-for-nothing tool is to possess some innate intractability to the designs of others. A more common sense use of the verb relates to the purposive employment of a thing. Here, use is a synonym for verbs like employ, instrumentalize, wield, exploit, manipulate, deploy. These are all terms that we do apply to human beings, albeit with caution. When we say that somebody is usefully employed, we are doubling down on their perceived sense of facility. There is a question, though, about how far useful employment intersects with meaningful occupation. A hedge fund manager can be said to be meaningfully employed in the sense that she's likely to receive remuneration, but it's doubtful that she is usefully employed in the sense of creating use values. Perhaps it's easier to say that a hedge fund rather than a hedge fund manager is usefully employed, in the sense that a hedge fund is imagined as a form of activated money, money which behaves, talks to itself, money as autonomous agent, semi-autonomous agent. Use in this sense becomes antonymical to practical utility or function, since it involves the sense of money's profitable animation, abstracted from and without the necessity for tangible output beyond digital tabulation. Use can thus imply the instrumentalization of money either as a means to an end or as an end in itself, so that use as a synonym for profit is co-opted by its rending away from use value as such. All this means there is a tension embedded within the word use, mirrored within the economic tension whereby profit eclipses use and utility, only to find itself without a useful mooring point in connection with which it can measure its scale. To assign use to something is to mediate the parameters between subject and object. And what is annoying about waste is the way it defies and frustrates the preferred terms of this relationship. Uselessness is more long-lasting than use, perhaps, more resilient and more permanent than usefulness. It's a kind of surplus adjacent to surplus value as profit. And there must be an ideological apparatus for framing this surplus uselessness of waste. The essentially temporal quality of all use is borne out in the past tense of the verb used. This elusive deployment seems to me to be rooted in the sense of used pertaining to habit. If you're used to doing something, you're inured to some action, some form of consumption or posture. But it also has to do with used as a synonym for used up or depleted or exhausted, which signifies a precedent process of using by way of which a thing has become used. To say that I used to do something, then, derives from the sense of use associated with custom, with a repeated action to which you are habituated. Yet it also chimes with the sense of time used up, an expenditure of the will, an investment of the I in orientation to an object or an activity that has passed into usedness by virtue of a discontinuation. In this way, use is woven into our language's construction of time, making it possible for time to be lost, but not in the sense contrary to found, rather in the sense contrary to profit. Time has to be made worthwhile. To use a day is to devote it to something valuable, which wedges the idea of idleness within the semantic intersection of unprofitability and uselessness. For Agnes Heller, Marx's work involves an identification of radical needs. Capitalism is adept at creating new needs, new products, new amendments, a need for money, a need for new standards of living, middle class need, working class need, the need for labor, raw materials. All this is part of capitalism's dynamism. But for the ultimate need which capitalism creates are those radical needs which it is unable to fulfill, needs which reach for something beyond the confines of the system. Heller writes that capitalism produces not only alienation, but the consciousness of alienation. In other words, radical needs, or as she quotes from Marx, consciousness exceeding its bounds. A society of associated producers, she says, is a society in which radical needs can come to be satisfied and around which a new structure of need is built. Surely this all calls for some kind of radical utility. In another discussion of need, recently published in translation by the New Left Review, Theodore Adorno posits an authentic productivity which in its genuine undistorted sense will have a real effect on need, not by assuaging unsatisfied needs with useless things, he says, but because once satisfied, people will be able to relate to the world without mangling it into universal usefulness. A classless society, Adorno says, promises the end and the beginning of art, the beginning of the useless, whose contemplation tends towards a reconciliation with nature because it no longer serves the uses of exploiters. What of uselessness? There is a growing body of scholarship which makes the case for its paradoxical value. The title of Michelle Howard's edited collection exemplifies the quality of such arguments, which often resort to a kind of instrumental logic as a means for valuing uselessness. In her Introduction for Uselessness, Humankind's Most Valuable Tool, Howard argues that embracing this category, preserving, valuing, and monetizing uselessness will become a basic necessity in a future age of hyper-intelligent, fully automated production. It's a posture reminiscent of Oscar Wilde, whom Howard discusses in her introduction alongside Adorno, Rancière, and Shang Tzu. Luciano Parodi proposes an integration of uselessness into the contemporary course of economics and politics. But here again, the act of integration feels like an affront to uselessness pure and simple, which in order to be truly useless needs to resist or frustrate our attempts to include it in anything. Integrating uselessness within contemporary economics surely compromises its radicalism. Perhaps uselessness, like Kristeva's Cora, can only be understood as an inchoate, primal, and generative a priori, which precedes and underpins the symbolic at the same time as it retreats into obscurity. As soon as uselessness steps into the arena of valuation, some of its essence has already been compromised. Robert Archambault has traced the poetic valuation of uselessness from Coleridge to Ashbery. The very idea that poetry is autonomous, he says, is itself an idea that serves a number of ends. Coleridge's version of aesthetic autonomy allows him to imagine a new class of intellectuals, a clerisy, allied with the established landowning order. Coleridge defends the traditional hierarchical structure of Anglican hermeneutics by chastising a mechanic or allegoric understanding of the Bible, which confounds symbols with allegories. Symbols for Coleridge are a mode of meaning that cannot be exhausted, since it stems from something beyond the immediate context of the maker and is not subject to the same communicative obligations that underpin allegory. In this same Coleridgean and perhaps also Tolkien-esque style, Peter Lamarck has argued that art can only be truly useless, can only really be considered as art, when and if the context of its making has receded from our view. He writes that McCarthy's The Road might indeed be useful today in affecting attitudes about climate change, but the novel will endure, if at all, and enter a more timeless canon of literature only as that usefulness recedes. But how would we understand a work of literature without a context? I'm forced to conclude that a work of art can never be truly useless as long as it's received within some kind of context. And if a work of art is able to reach beyond its context, surely this is testament to a particular kind of usefulness, an abiding symbolic power, as opposed to a single-use allegory. Understanding, it seems to me, is a kind of use. Meaning throws the literary object into the continuum of cause and effect. If the artist does echo the gratuitous act of creation, then she can never hope to do so perfectly, since her making does not spring out of nothing, and because any communion with her work on our part must exist within the time-bound context of our reception of it. David Jones begins the anathemata with an image of an ancient Christian rite, but one infused with Jones's own sacramental imagination as it moves in ever-widening circles of metonymy radiating from the incarnational center point of Christ. I have Gareth Downs to thank for that description. The rite in question is that of intercalation, a ceremony for readjusting the erring calendar of the fallen cosmos, which thus needs periodically to be put back in order. As always with Jones, the religious is interceded with the militaristic, in keeping with his formative encounter with the Catholic liturgy in the backlands of the Somme. This is part of the opening to the anathemata. These rearguard details in their quaint attire, heedless of incongruity, unconscious that the flanks are turned and all connecting files withdrawn or liquidated, that dead symbols litter the base of the cult stone, that the stem by the pallid stone is thirsty, that the stream is very low. The Utile Infiltration nowhere held, creeps vestibule, is already at the closed lattices, is coming through each door. This is an image of the ex-utile, assailed by an encroaching utility of which the actors are nonetheless heedless. Unmindful of a creeping enemy by which they are beset, undaunted by their own anachronicity, the participants of the rite resemble a besieged squadron. The apostolic architecture is a comically insufficient rampart, albeit for the observer's single-mindedness which the architecture fosters. There is a kind of anhydrous survival. Their sanctuary is seemingly on the brink of being overcome by the utile infiltration that hangs in the air. It is a posture that Jones had imbibed from his reading of Francis Maritain in the 1920s. As Thomas Dilworth describes it, Maritain contends that art is fundamentally sacramental, making art, therefore, a kind of prayer. And for Jones, Dilworth continues, beauty is achievable in art as it is not in nature, since art escapes the effects of the fall. We might then say that art does have an end, but that the end is sacramental rather than utile. Art is ex-utile use, which incidentally chimes with another archaic sense of the word use, which the OED informs us has been used to mean simply a religious rite, a use. The anathemata begins with one such use, because it is an analogy for the process of making the poem enacts. It is a poem about the problem, perhaps the impossibility, of achieving a miraculous transformation of the profane into the sacred, an undertaking that can only be achieved in language by exorcising its communicative function, but which is always undone by our own communion with the meaning of the work, which reintegrates it into the continuum of cause and effect. In a BBC broadcast on poetry and religion, Jones gave a cogent sketch of his Maritanesque theory of art. Art for Jones is extra-utile, and the process of making it involves a transformation of fallen matter into sacrament-worthy stuff. This is Jones. He says, "The animal we call man is a creature which, from its earliest beginnings, has consistently shown a duality of behavior, On the one hand, it has occupied itself, as have innumerable other creatures, with astonishing ingenuities directed towards quite obvious and practical ends. On the other, unlike other creatures, it has been equally occupied with activities which are far from having any obvious end. But all acts must be directed towards some end, and the only end that suggests itself is that these activities are done for a sign, significant of something other. We feel justified in calling this creature man not only the supreme utilist, but the only extra utilist, or sacramentalist. The legion's ordered line, a thing of total practicality and devastating utility, confronts us in history, along with the ordered line of the hexameter, as a thing wholly extra utile and explicable only as a sign. I'll just finish with this. In order to bring both the utile and the extra utile into focus, in order to save uselessness from instrumentalization, I want to establish some other sets. One woodcutting by Jones depicts a synergy of the utile and the extra utile locked in perfect conjunction. But this conjunction can only exist if we consider a third shadow category of disutility, from which utility and extra utility can be distinguished. What Jones abhors is not utility as such. Indeed, he uses the term utile in other instances as a way for describing the efficacy of his own artistic apparatus. Utility for Jones is not a bad thing. What he warns against, rather, is an overbearing, maladroit utility, which encroaches on the extra utile and starves it of its potency. Utility is to be celebrated insofar as it is in equipoise with the ex-utile. My own suggestion is that we use disutility to describe this ineptitude of tools and functional objects which thus impede our ex-utile fulfillment. Disutility, then, can be used to describe those manifold objects in the world which simply do not fulfill the purpose for which they are intended. This is simple enough, but it is the only way, it's only by way of this disutility that ex-utility can be distinguished. If we are to speak about the autotelic at all, then we can only do so by insisting on the reality of the disutile, by insisting, in other words, that the uselessness of art is not of the same order as the uselessness of a badly designed door. We can affirm the uselessness of art whilst simultaneously bemoaning the uselessness of Windows 10, the wastefulness of industry, the inefficiency of state provision. And we can do so not only because that one uselessness is separate from the other, but because the one uselessness, disutility, impedes the realization of the other. It does this in a practical sense by frustrating and limiting our efforts to realize our ex-utile impulses. But it also does this in a categorical sense, since the confusion of disutility and ex-utility is what leads to the overvaluation of a false utility as the sole category of worth. So too, disutility might encompass those activities that have metastasized into the realm of ex-utility via their abandonment of a properly utile role. A finance capitalism, which has forsaken money, commodity money in favor of money, is the most obvious case in point. Money as an end of it in itself is a kind of evil, then, because it apes the truth process of genuine ex-utility in the same moment as it eviscerates ex-utility as an arena for human meaning. That's the law. Thank you, John, for inviting me to speak. It's a real pleasure. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. Cheers. I don't know whether John is with us. He's not, so we're going to pass over to Terry now.
And I'm going to chair from outside.
Okay.
I'm going to try and get you.
Yes.
Take it away, Terry.
Thanks, Andrew. I want to begin in a very modest kind of way really by just saying a few words about God and the universe, and then having dealt with these rather minor affairs, I'll move on to more substantial matters, if I may. I won't, incidentally, say very much, and I'll signal occasionally how much I agree with what Andrew says. I suppose, theologically speaking, the supreme example of uselessness is God. I mean, God is completely useless, supremely pointless. It's one of the very few points on which atheists and or agnostics and believers can agree. He's pointless in the sense that, of course, he doesn't exist for anything. He doesn't, in the term Andrew used, he doesn't have a function. He's not for something else. He lives the life of pure self-delight, pure exuberance, and life for its own sake, abundance of life, which is sometimes known theologically as grace, and which, when we share, if we do, we too then become completely useless. In that sense, in that creative sense of the word, Andrew pointed out other senses, in which we too can live as far as possible by our own, simply for the sake of self-delight. God has his ends and grounds and origins entirely in himself, and is therefore, the classic example of what Andrew was calling autotelism, literally that which is an end in itself. If you want to say that somebody's useless, but you want to blunt the blow a little, you can say you're just autotelic. You're completely bloody autotelic. Now, to say as theology says that the world, that God creates the world, isn't in the first place, I think, to talk about God as a celestial manufacturer. Actually, the New Testament, the Christian gospel, has almost nothing to say about God as creator of the world, though presumably it didn't believe that. It's perfectly possible to believe theologically, so one of the greatest of all theologians, Thomas Aquinas, thought, it's perfectly possible to think that God never started the world, in the sense that the world never had an origin. In that, Aquinas didn't actually believe that himself, but he certainly thought that was theologically reasonable. And of course, his great mentor, Aristotle, did believe that. Aristotle thought the world had existed from all eternity. There's nothing untheological in believing that, because creation isn't about that. It's not about some super manufacture. It's about the fact that the world is radically dependent on God. It exists because of him, and because it does, because God is pure freedom and autonomy and self-determination. To be wholly self-determining is to be free. Because of that, then for the world to depend on him, to be created by him, is for it to be all those things too. The paradox then is that it's the world's dependence on God for theological tradition, which is the very condition of its freedom, its autonomy, its self-determination. Perhaps a sort of rather lame analogy, but a child's dependence on its parents, which one hopes it gradually grows out of, is the ground and condition of its becoming independent. If it doesn't have a certain kind of dependence, then it won't become independent at all. Part also, I think, of the doctrine of creation is the notion that because because God doesn't have to do anything necessarily, yes. I mean, in fact, it looks, as I was saying the other day, it looks as though since the sixth day of creation, he hasn't done a tap. He hasn't done a stroke. I mean, where's he been? What has actually been doing? Nothing at all. Just as Jesus is an archetypal vagrant who is very kind of work shy, he certainly doesn't seem to do much work. Labour, work, productivity is not the issue, and is certainly not to be smuggled into the very different idea of creation. Creation includes, as a phrase that Andrew, I think, used, the idea of a gratuitous act. The world doesn't exist because God had to create it. It's not, as it were, the inevitable step in some predetermined process. It exists gratuitously, what that's to say, as a gift. It exists for the hell of it, to use a technical theological term. And that's to say that, you know, as I suppose the left bank existentialists would have said in the 50s and 60s, the world is the primordial act gratuit, the act which has no apparent rationale, and it is also a living critique of instrumental reason just by virtue of what it is. However, and here I'm very much in agreement with Andrew said, we mustn't thereby demonize the idea of utility, or indeed demonize the idea of instrumental rationality. Not even the Frankfurt School, who are very opposed to instrumental rationality, demonize it or write it off. Adorno, for example, probably the finest Marxist cultural theoretician ever, finds something to redeem about it. There could be no radical politics, for example, without some kind of instrumental ends, means, rationality. Nothing wrong with that, just that one has to loosen, if one can, the terrifying grip that it has upon our reason, upon our conduct, upon our identities in this kind of society. It's also, I think, the case, interestingly, if you think about, I mean, people sometimes say, and I think I've said this myself in the past, you know, all the best things are useless. You know, love, what's the point of that, for them to say, you know, art, play, eating Frank Cooper's Oxford thick-cut marmalade, which is terrific stuff. And there's no point in eating it. Oh, yeah, why not? You could eat some very inferior brand of marmalade. I get a small fee from Frank Cooper's company for just dropping this into the conversation each time I speak. There are no point in those activities. However, I said before, the life of first of all, uselessness, as I'll say a bit later, can be associated with an offensive kind of privilege. Yes, it's the aristocrat who, par excellence, finds himself through not working, not laboring. But also, there's a usefulness in the gospel that I said. The life of grace is essentially just for its own exuberance and abundance and self-delight, and evil is a kind of inability to be alive, a kind of living dead situation of vacancy, nihilism. Nevertheless, of course, grace also encompasses the useful. It encompasses feeding the hungry. It encompasses caring for the sick, visiting those in prison, all that very mundane stuff in Matthew's Gospel, which is the very measure of one's salvation, amazingly, just these very kind of daily, commonplace, really, activities. However, you might say, in order to avoid too sharp a contrast between the useless here and the usefulness of doing things like feeding the sick, feeding the hungry, you might say, well, actually, when you get down to it, what's the point of feeding the hungry? You know, what's the point of helping the sick and so on? I don't mean in some really brutal way to say, why not just let them go hungry? I mean, you do it, but you could also legitimately raise the question of why. And if you do, the only kind of answer it seems to me that you can finally give, as the only kind of answer you can really give to any ethical question in the end, is because of the need for the fullest common self-realization as one can get. That's a very Aristotelian and Thomist notion, I think. And if you're hungry or thirsty or imprisoned or sick, you're cut off from that. One of the reasons I think why Jesus, if you open the gospel at random, you're almost bound to find Jesus curing somebody or other. Maybe there were people who objected to his curing them. I don't know. It'd be interesting if they didn't really want it. But curing somebody is bringing them back, as it were, into full, active, self-realizing members of the community. Otherwise, they're sort of shut out. So, if you think so, in a way, even the most practical kinds of ethical activity, which are, for Christianity at least, the criterion of salvation. That's one of many ways in which I think Christianity is not really a religion in certain traditional senses of that word. Even those things, if you ask, well, why do them? You end up with an answer like, for the sake of the fuller self-realization of life, which ultimately for Christianity is the life of grace, as you can achieve. There is, however, another way perhaps of deconstructing the opposition between uselessness and use, or rather thinking of use. Andrew gave a number of very illuminating ways, I think, in which one can rethink the very concept of use, the very term use. And one other way, to which I might add to his agenda, as it were, is to just say a little more about use value, which he talked about. Use value as it occurs in Marx in Capital, Volume 1. Marx, as is well known, makes a distinction between use value and exchange value. What's wrong with exchange value essentially is that it abstracts from the specificity of objects, or indeed of people, which become then abstractly and equally exchangeable. This is the commodity form for Marx, because they both contain the same amount of labour power. All of that's rather technical stuff, but the point to carry away is objects become dead level. They become flatly interchangeable, and indeed people do as well. Now, the point about use value is not, and here I agree again with what Andrew said in à la Maritain, so at the end, the point about use value is not a point against using things. What Marx, I think, means by use value is to use things with a due respect to their sensuous particularity. And one example of that, I think, would be, say you drank some very fine malt whiskey simply in order to get drunk. Well, nothing wrong with that if you want to, but you could equally well use some very cheap sherry or whatever, some inferior wine. Any alcoholic thing would have done. What you're not doing is attending to the use value of the malt whiskey. You're not attending to its, unique palate and flavour and taste and so on. So to use things, even instrumentally, in respect and awareness of their sensuous particularity, of, if you like, their individuality, is, I think, what Marx means by use value. And Marx is all, incidentally, as opposed to the crude caricatures of Marx's thought rampant among the right, Marx is all about individuality, all about, he doesn't like abstractions, for example. He's all about preserving what is tangible and concrete. And to that extent, you might say, Marx's thinking is aesthetic through and through, because what is the discourse arising sometime around 1750, which par excellence speaks of the sensuous specificity? It is the aesthetic, that strange, new, odd intellectual creature which is born at the heart of Enlightenment in Europe and Central Europe, and which rapidly becomes a dominant feature of almost every major philosopher who follows from there on. There is a link there, strangely perhaps, between aestheticism and socialism, and again, who is one of the key nexuses between those two. Andrew mentioned him already, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is, of course, an aesthete par excellence, but also a socialist, the man who wrote a wonderful pamphlet called The Soul of Man under Socialism, which was very well received among the labour movement of his time, and so on. And there's absolutely no contradiction in that, absolutely no contradiction, because for one reason, aestheticism in its richest meaning doesn't mean replacing life with art and all that sort of boring idea. It means, for people like Wilde, trying to live life like a work of art. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means trying to realize and fulfill one's diverse potentialities, powers, capacities, and so on, as far as possible. And that also is absolutely the ethics of Karl Marx. Marx wants a society in which that is possible, in which everybody can fulfill those kinds of capacities. But crucially, to do that, as Marx sees, you have to have leisure. And Wilde was an expert on leisure. It was the only thing he really knew about. You have to shorten the working day, as Marx said. You have to try to relieve the curse of labour. It goes all the way back to the commandment to rest on the Sabbath, which has nothing to do with going to church. There weren't any churches in those days. It has to do with resting, leisure, not making a fetish out of production. God rests on the seventh day, and Marxism, in a good Judaic tradition, is all about leisure and not labour, about, as far as possible, automating or organising labour production so that what? Well, you can't pre-draft it, just that people then have the time to live in whatever way they want. So one can move. So there is, in that sense, I think, a close connection between the aesthetic and socialism, which, of course, again, is very obvious in the figure of the great William Morris at the time of Weil. Let me just finally say, everybody wants to be useful, but nobody wants to be used. What is it to be used? Well, in the negative sense of the word. Well, among other things, Andrew spoke of some of them, but among other things, to be treated instrumentally, but with no respect to one's own specific needs and desires, those being, as it were, cancelled and negated by the act of using. And that is obviously objectionable, but it coexists with the more positive sense of use, which is being useful. So you can be useful, but you don't have to be used. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Hello. Thank you, Terry. I believe I'm on chairing duty in the absence of John, so I will open out to people who want to say something and hopefully click the right buttons to allow you to speak. So any questions or comments?
Andrew, I'm in the corner of the room here.
Oh, okay.
So do feel free to, can you see the chat bar?
Yes.
Okay, there we are. You can invite chat bar questions or hand raised. I'll leave it to you.
Okay. Okay. Well, would anybody like to raise their hand or? Oh, we have some hands raised. Lovely. Let me find out whose hands are raised. Tom Dilworth. Hello. Hello there, Tom. Do I have to unmute you?
No.
Okay, you're muted.
I have my microphone off. Good to see you.
Hello, Tom. We can hear you.
Your term disutility seems to imply that it's not useful, and that's a problem. I was thinking of something like meta-utile, but I think, God, there's so much going on here. Jacques Ellul is somebody who certainly should be part of this conversation. He wrote the Technological Society, which was translated in the 1960s. It's a great book, a prophetic book, and it encapsulates what David Jones, who is a great prophet in this respect, saw as the huge major problem of the modern world, which is utilitarianism, pragmatism taking over from everything else. And we can see this in the emphasis in especially the British universities now on pragmatism. Truth, beauty, and goodness are the non-utilitarian values. And truth in a university now is only valuable if you've got patents that make money. This is insane. And what Terry was talking about, the usefulness of doing something positive and charitable to somebody, I thought of Bartleby the Scrivener, where the narrator invites Bartleby home with him, but the narrator never expresses, and we're inside the narrator's head, the narrator never expresses or feels love for Bartleby. It seems to me that the alternatives to utility are beauty, truth, and goodness. And truth and goodness can be reduced to evolutionary, beneficial, utilitarian values. But beauty can't. When someone's at the mouth of the cave looking at the setting sun, that's when the saber-toothed tiger hits him from the side. Beauty is not a practical advantage, although propaganda and certainly pornography tries to use beauty for some other practical reason, making money. But beauty itself seems to me irreducible. And I guess I should just say, don't you think that this is not an abstract academic objective discussion, that we're really in a crisis, a civilizational crisis, in which the gratuitous is being lost in emphasis to the utilitarian in terms of people's work lives? This is the main cause of alienation. I'm sorry that I'm just throwing that all at you, but it's very early in the morning where I am.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that, Tom. For anyone that doesn't know, Tom is a scholar of David Jones and probably has various objections to what I just said about David Jones. Terry.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. Could I just say a word about, we've been using the word utilitarianism. Now, it's okay to use it as, perhaps we have generally been using it as a general word for the philosophy of use or the ideology of use. Yes, but as Andrew and I both try to point out, there are good and worse, there are better and worse notions of use. And utilitarianism anyway isn't just about that, is it? I mean, utilitarianism in the sense of Benthamism, the philosophy created by Jeremy Bentham, the turn of the 19th century, and which became the dominant ideology of Victorian ruling class England, including people who actually were quite close friends of Dickens. It's very interesting that though Dickens, as Andrew says, grossly caricatures utilitarianism, quotes some of his best friends were utilitarians, and he himself had a very brisk, progressivist, modernizing utilitarian streak. But utilitarianism proper, Benthamism, isn't just about use, is it? It's a very specific idea, for example, of utility, which is largely hedonistic. For Bentham, essentially you make a calculus of pleasures and pains, and that plunges you into all sorts of horrific ethical problems. It's also, as I just said, it's a calculus. Everybody counts as one, and then you begin to calculate pleasures and pains on that basis. It's also, in a way, a retrospective ethics, because you don't really know how this is going to pan out, how many, as it were, pleasures and pains your deed will create among how many people, until afterwards, fully. So there are all sorts of problems with the official philosophy of utilitarianism. And I don't think it's enough to say, well, utilitarianism is the problem. Yes, it is, if we're thinking in specific terms about Benthamism. But as I think, as Andrew and I both try to argue, there are notions of use which are not only sort of valid, but deeply necessary. Deeply necessary. And to argue otherwise is to run the risk of the more privileged kinds of uselessness, as it were, the less appealing sides of Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, I mean, on the subject of the less appealing side of Oscar Wilde, I read Soul of Man Under Socialism again the other day. There's a lot of Malthusianism in there, or he seems to be flirting with Malthusianism quite heavily. I wondered at times whether he was sort of assuming the posture of a Malthusian in order to be, in order to court scandal. But then at the other, and then on the other hand, I thought, well, maybe he really means it. Maybe he does ask the question, doesn't he, about what's the point in feeding the poor? He kind of goes there in the Solomon Socialism.
Although that's partly, I think that partly is a satirical dig of the benevolence, as it were. It's an interesting essay, isn't it? Because in a sense, he's saying, well, yes, all of this industrial, utilitarian, instrumental rationality is okay. Let that take care of productivity, and then that will free us for what's really important, that which is beyond utility. Now, in that, I think he's actually much closer to Marx than William Morris is. I mean, Wilde wasn't a Marxist, but Morris sure was a Marxist. But Morris has the opposite kind of notion of production, namely, don't try, or at least don't put at the centre the idea of abolishing it, make it creative. Dismantle the opposition between art and labour. There are two traditions there, I think, in the labour movement, aren't there? One is get rid of the stuff as far as you can, and the other is, well, transform it into something more creative. I think Wilde stands in the first tradition, and so does Marx, actually.
Dolly Sharma, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I typed it in the chat box. So if you could please elaborate on that, it would be helpful.
On you didn't hear the. Sorry, did you say you didn't hear the title? Was that?
No, I'm saying that like which attribute would you associate with Beckett play Waiting for Godot? Useful or useless, and why?
Okay, good question. Beckett and uselessness. I don't know. Terry.
Thank you, Andrew.
This is the privilege of being the half answering questions, half sharing.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, Beckett again. Nobody really works in Beckett, do they? Oddly, we think of the two, Vladimir and Estragon in Godot, as tramps, though nobody actually says they're tramps, and stage direction doesn't say they're tramps, but they're generally presented as that. They're certainly homeless and wandering, and they don't do any work, and neither does anybody else in Beckett. You know, they sit in dustbins and try and touch each other and so on, but they don't do any work because, well, to give a very grandiose and overgeneral response, modernism is not really very interested in production. You know, I mean, realism, the great tradition of classical realism from time to time, certainly from Balzac to Zola, is indeed interested in the realm of production which makes value possible. It's a thoroughly materialist genre, which sees that in order for the middle classes to have their fancy feelings and their fine values, a lot of tedious spay work has to be done in the first place. And realism actually shows some of that, but as indeed as Dickens. But modernism on the whole doesn't. You know, modernism Beckett is in a kind of post-production world, because in a sense it's a post-historical world, you might argue, and production and history, you know, are sides of the same coin. So all you can do in that space that's created by not doing anything, by inertia, is just tell one gratuitous tale after another, with very little logical connection between them, none of them in the least founded, certainly not founded on each other, and then just as it were, keep going. There is nonetheless a kind of necessity, isn't there, beneath that in Beckett, lurking somewhere in the background, which is the necessity to write, the necessity to do this. You know, I can't go on, you know, I must go on, I will go on. And that means that's about writing as much as anything. When a writer really disengages, you might argue, then he or she stops writing. Beckett's a strange instance of somebody who seems to have disengaged, but can't help carrying on, but can't help in that blind, pointless persistence, which is the impulse to write.
And is there any value in the waiting for Godot?
Any value? Oh yes, of course. It's for one thing very funny. You know, if that's not a value, I don't know what is. It's a masterpiece of artistry, and there's, and to take your question more literally, there may well be value in waiting for Godot, because what if Godot's arrival turns out to be a total catastrophe? Why does everybody seem to assume that if only Godot would come, they would be redeemed? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe deferment, endless deferment, is the best way to live. Maybe that's a kind of value. Well, this actually is a very interesting and rather poignant statement of value, direct statement of value in Godot, which is at one point a very moving statement, I think, when, I can't remember who it is, which of the two characters says to the other, you know, at least something like, I'm paraphrasing, at least we will know, or it will be known, that at this place, at this time, we waited for Godot. You know, maybe fruitlessly, maybe he didn't come, you know, but we remain faithful to this enigmatic impulse just to wait. And that's a kind of value.
And, you know, yeah.
Sorry, Dolly, go on.
So, yeah, sorry. So if like we assume that there is no value, I mean, of course you say that there is value in this waiting, but if we assume that there is no usefulness, it is uselessness, it is a uselessness thing that they are doing, they are just waiting. So, and then you call that God is within quotes useless. So because they are waiting is and doing this useless act is why they are waiting for God. If they were doing a useful act like engaging themselves in some production, maybe some producing some objects of utility, so could they be waiting for perhaps a car then, which lends value and efficiency, because then man doesn't have to, you know, do movement, and they could use a car and go wherever they want to go.
Well, first of all, Dory, they're not waiting for God, they're waiting for Godot. I mean, Beckett's particularly denied that if he said if they were waiting for God, he would have said they were waiting for God. I think one of the great values of that play is that when it was first produced in London, and everybody in a very fashionable theatre, and everybody thought it was a very weird and outlandish thing. It wasn't long into the play when somebody shouted out from the audience, "This is the kind of thing that lost us the empire." That means to me that that's a great value in the play. Somebody had unwittingly put his finger on it. You know, this kind of apparent nihilism was an affront to everything that Tory imperialist England held dear. You know, and I very much imagine that Beckett was quite pleased by that.
I think what I'd add to that is one of the things that I was trying to point out was the close relationship between meaning and use in the way that we tend to talk about meaning. The word point is an interesting intersection between use. You may say, oh, what's the point? Or what is the point of this play? What is the point of doing this? That can mean two things, can't it? It can either mean what does this mean? What's it about? Or it can mean, is there a kind of a useful end? And I think trying to disentangle the differences between use as meaning and use as value is really difficult. I think we've got there's a lot of you know, even think of the word usage. It seems bound up with what meaning is. Yeah, that's what I was trying to kind of get at. One of the things I was trying to get at and maybe didn't quite manage to get at. I think we are drawing to a close.